The era of Western global domination is over. The global South has finally become powerful enough to match and even surpass the United States and its European allies in many ways. This revolution in world politics has become possible through the alliance of countries called BRICS, representing its founding members of Brazil, Russia, India, China, and South Africa. Donald Trump's policies of declaring a trade war on nearly the entire world have accelerated moves by the global South to rapidly end the US dollar's status as the world reserve currency and create a new world economic system. There's a good chance you haven't heard much about this alliance or their massive moves behind the scenes because they're barely covered in mainstream media, even though what they're doing is literally rewriting the world order in real time. We are living through a fundamental equalization of world power from the global north, consisting of countries that make up only around 15% of the world population, to the global south, or what should rightfully be called the global majority, representing the remaining 85% of humanity. After centuries of Western colonization and decades of modern dominance since World War II, the balance of power is finally beginning to shift. The world is moving towards a more equal and multipolar order, where new powers are rising and old empires are starting to crumble. In today's video, we'll explore how the BRICS bloc is building alternate systems that will completely reshape the global landscape, the rapid decline of the US dollar, and the rise of the global south through initiatives like China's Belt and Road. Now let's get to it. With the collapse of the Soviet Union in 1991, the US emerged as the only great power, and along with its Western former colonial powers in the G7, they've dominated the world through three main methods. The first method is military domination. After the Cold War, the US no longer had a great power rival to challenge its dominance. But instead of dismantling its massive military and covert apparatus, the United States doubled down and became the world's police force, suppressing any potential rivals. This strategy was formalized in the Wolfowitz Doctrine, named after its chief architect, Secretary of Defense Paul Wolfowitz. The doctrine outlined a post-Cold War strategy to maintain US global hegemony through full-spectrum world dominance. The United States currently has 750 military bases around the world located in 80 countries precisely to maintain this position. NATO, originally formed as a defensive alliance against the USSR, was not dismantled. Instead, it was expanded into more countries and became an increasingly aggressive and offensive bloc. The pact actively sought to recreate Russia into an enemy rather than integrate it into the world. Unknown to most, Russia actually had desires to move closer to Europe after the Soviet collapse. Russia made attempts to be accepted into both the European Union and NATO, only to be laughed off by European countries. At the same time, the West broke the promise given to Russia that NATO would not expand eastward. NATO admitted several countries into the military alliance on Russia's border despite zero reason to do so. Even most of the US State Department was adamantly opposed to NATO expansion as they believed they had just defeated the Soviet Union, so why were they creating a new enemy in Russia? Despite that, warhawks in Washington, led by none other than Joe Biden himself, played a key role in NATO expansion eastward in the 90s, directly setting the stage for future conflict.
Where do they go? I had one interesting comment. Our conversation with Zaganoff was repeated with Lebed. They talked about they don't want this NATO expansion. They know it's not in their security interests and on, and said, well, and if you do that, we may have to look to China. And I couldn't help using the colloquial expression from my state by saying to Zaganoff, lots of luck in your senior year. Good luck. And if that doesn't work, try Iran. I'm serious. I said that to them, and these were, and they know, I knew, they knew, everybody knows that is not an option. And everybody knows, every one of those leaders acknowledges and needs, and they resent it. But they need to look west.
That one aged like shit. Exactly the opposite happened where Russia, China, and Iran have all joined together in BRICS, and his push to enlarge NATO directly led to needless conflicts. NATO has also participated in notorious bombing campaigns in several nations in the Balkans, as well as completely destroying Libya, a country that once enjoyed the highest standards of living on the African continent, which is now a failed state. Through the United States military and NATO, Western countries were able to prevent any peer competitors from rising. The second method is through the West's domination of international institutions like the United Nations. Nations that sit on the UN Security Council hold the highest form of international power through their ability to veto resolutions. Any nation sitting on the council can block significant actions such as military interventions, sanctions, or the admission of new members with a single no vote. The West has a majorly disproportionate influence in the council, with the US, UK, and France controlling 3 of the 5 veto spots, despite accounting for less than 6% of the world population. Countries with much larger populations and economies, like India, Indonesia, and Brazil, have no permanent representation in the Security Council. As a result, the Security Council reflects the time in which it was created in 1945 and not 2025. This system has frequently been used to dominate the global south. For example, it's been used to block resolutions to end the embargo on Cuba, despite the entire world voting against it every year. It also runs cover for war crimes, repeatedly vetoing resolutions that call for ceasefires, and voting to make food a human right, where nearly the entire world votes in favor except the United States and its closest ally. The third and perhaps most crucial method is financial domination. After World War II, the Allied powers met at the Bretton Woods Conference in 1944 to design the new global financial system. It was here that institutions like the World Bank and the International Monetary Fund, or the IMF, were created. These institutions lend money to poor nations, often during financial crisis or for long-term development projects. But they give them this money with a catch. In exchange for loans, these countries are required to implement harsh structural adjustment programs. These programs force nations to adopt economic reforms that are primarily designed to benefit Western corporations. To secure the desperately needed loans, countries are pressured to cut public welfare spending, manipulate their currencies, and remove restrictions on foreign investors, allowing corporations to extract profits with little oversight. As a result, these countries are trapped in a cycle of debt and dependency, preventing them from achieving real economic independence. This system ensures that poor countries stay poor while rich countries continue to thrive. However, beyond the influence of international organizations, the most significant form of American financial domination began in 1944 with the establishment of the US dollar as the world's reserve currency. This is what economists call the exorbitant privilege of the US dollar. It might come as a shock to many of you just how global trade actually works and how dominant the US dollar truly is. The US dollar is used in over half of the world's total trade transactions. For example, if you're a businessman in Germany looking to buy an industrial product from China, you might assume the transaction would be settled in euros or yuan, as those are the local currencies of the countries involved. However, that's not the case. Instead, the German buyer would first go to a commercial bank to exchange euros for US dollars. These Wall Street banks benefit by charging fees for currency exchange and cross-border transfers. This process is a major revenue generator for the banks as they take a cut from every transaction. The Chinese seller would then convert those dollars into yuan through a Chinese bank. This is incredibly beneficial for the United States because they get to act as a middleman even though they aren't adding any value to the transaction. Because the US dollar is so essential for global trade, demand for it remains high. Poor nations are constantly in need of US dollars to trade, which prevents them from strengthening their own local currencies. Additionally, these countries are often forced to export raw materials priced in dollars, meaning they have to accept low prices for their exports while paying higher prices for imports. This dependency on dollar-based trade and debt keeps them in a role of raw material exporters, unable to develop diversified high-value industries. Take Argentina, for example. The country's need for US dollars to import essential goods, pay off international debts, and conduct trade has led to a persistent shortage of dollars. This constant demand for foreign currency weakens the Argentine peso, causing inflation and economic instability. As the peso continues to lose value, the nation is trapped in a vicious cycle of poverty and worsening economic conditions. This ongoing crisis has forced Argentina to constantly turn to the IMF for bailouts. The country is by far the biggest recipient of bailouts from the IMF, with a whopping 23 to the tune of $177 billion since 1958. Argentinians rightfully blame the IMF for exacerbating their crisis by pushing through austerity on a country already suffering. With leftist lawmaker Miriam Bergman stating, "All past experiences with the IMF in our country have been terrible. Many Argentinians will not be able to retire." The IMF themselves admitted to screwing over Argentina, saying its policies failed to achieve the proposed objectives. Recently, the United States has bailed out the country to the tune of $40 billion due to the complete failure of the anarcho-capitalist policies of its current leader, Javier Milei. Argentina's situation is not unique. This is the same case for many developing nations where the overwhelming demand for dollars in global trade obstructs their ability to strengthen their own currencies and achieve long-term economic stability. When profits are made around the world, governments, central banks, and elites often reinvest their dollars back into the US through the stock market, US treasuries, or real estate because they see the US as a secure investment. Their reinvestment creates a feedback loop as global demand for US assets increases the demand for the US dollar. As a result, the dollar remains in high circulation globally, reinforcing its status as the world's primary reserve currency. At home in the US, the dominance of the dollar allows the US to do things no other country on earth could get away with. With a national debt approaching $37 trillion, the US can essentially print money without facing the immediate consequences that would send other nations into a currency crisis. This massive privilege could have been used to build America into a super utopia, easily providing every citizen with free healthcare, education, and a nationwide high-speed rail network. Instead, America squandered its biggest advantage by spending that money on pointless wars and bailing out massive banks in 2008 and 2020. The 20-year-long war on terror alone cost the US $8 trillion, with little to show for it except replacing the Taliban with the Taliban, creating ISIS, and completely destabilizing the Middle East. Any of these crises would have crushed another country's economy, but the dollar has allowed America to weather these storms. The dollar-dominated system is used as a weapon against countries the US doesn't like as a form of economic warfare. Since the US dollar's role as the world's reserve currency is so crucial for global trade, denying a country's access to it through sanctions is incredibly devastating. This is done by cutting sanctioned countries off from Western banking and financial institutions, effectively isolating them from international trade. This tactic is used to create misery for civilian populations in countries the US dislikes. The goal is often to create such unbearable conditions, including a lack of access to life-saving medicine, that the population will rise up and overthrow their government and replace it with one aligned with US interests. Countries like Cuba, Iran, North Korea, and Venezuela are often mocked by the US for their poor economies, when it is unquestionably a direct result of the world's largest superpower preventing their participation in global trade. But it's not just countries that the US perceives as boogeymen. The US has regularly slapped sanctions on the vast majority of the world's nations at some point. Currently, countries on the sanctions list include some of the poorest on earth, like Somalia, the Central African Republic, and South Sudan. The pretext of these sanctions is the US lecturing about freedom, democracy, and human rights, while the US regularly violates and openly ignores international law. Undoubtedly, many of the countries sanctioned by the US aren't perfect and have their own human rights violations. However, these sanctions don't achieve anything except causing untold misery and death among millions of people who have nothing to do with their governments. And let's be honest, the idea that the US actually cares about these human rights is bogus. The US will gladly work with any regime as long as they align with US interests. The US provides military assistance to 73% of the world's dictatorships. Sanctions are simply a tool to prevent any country that defies the US from developing. Unsurprisingly, outside the former colonial countries, the entire world is fed up with the system. The world has frequently voted to condemn the US frivolous use of sanctions at the United Nations, but the dollar's dominance and Western control over global institutions is rapidly crumbling, and that is where BRICS comes into play. On June 16, 2009, BRIC was founded, consisting of Brazil, Russia, India, and China, and quickly admitted South Africa to become BRICS. The founding members looked around at an unfair world system that did not reflect the true composition and interests of the world population. By creating an economic bloc, these countries finally had the power to actually make a change. Every year, the bloc expands, and it has already surpassed the G7 in most metrics. The official members have expanded to include Ethiopia, Iran, the United Arab Emirates, Egypt, and Indonesia. And partner countries have expanded to include Belarus, Bolivia, Cuba, Kazakhstan, Malaysia, Nigeria, Thailand, Uganda, Uzbekistan, and Vietnam. BRICS is now the global majority, representing 56% of the global population. Of the top 10 most populous countries on Earth, BRICS compose 6 of the top 10 and 3 of the top 4. The founding 4 members of the bloc have already far surpassed the G7 economies in terms of purchasing power parity, not even taking into consideration the additional 15 members of the alliance. This gap is only set to widen as nearly all BRICS countries are experiencing rapid growth. Take a look at this graph comparing the growth rates of BRICS countries, shown in yellow, versus the G7 represented in blue. It's very clear where the wind is blowing. While BRICS countries are surging ahead, G7 growth rates are stagnating. This stagnation is largely because G7 economies are driven by finance and speculative bubbles rather than real industry. Western economies, especially the United States, abandoned industrial production decades ago and have become heavily dependent on the FIRE sector, or finance, insurance, and real estate. In fact, the FIRE sector now contributes about 20 to 21% of total US GDP, making it the largest single contributor among all US industries. But these sectors are not based in the real economy and are incredibly unstable and collapse every 10 years or so, as we have seen in the dot-com bubble, 2008 financial crisis, and 2020, to name a few examples. Meanwhile, BRICS countries hold the vast majority of industrial and raw materials capacity, making the West largely dependent on BRICS in a variety of critical areas. Rare earth minerals are the most important resource of the 21st century. Whether it be renewable energy, electric vehicles, or almost all forms of modern missiles and weaponry, you need rare earth minerals, and the BRICS alliance has a dominant 72% control of rare earth reserves. On top of that, even if the West has rare earth minerals, they have no capacity to refine them, as China alone controls 92% of all rare earth mineral refining, which is essentially a monopoly. For the West to develop their own industry to extract and refine these materials would take decades, so for the foreseeable future, the West cannot modernize or wage large-scale warfare without China or BRICS. Also, China alone accounts for nearly a third of all manufacturing in the world at 29%, and that number is expected to rise to nearly half of the world output by 2050. At the same time, manufacturing as a part of Western economies continues to fall. All of this goes to show that we are no longer in a unipolar moment. We have officially entered a multipolar geopolitical era where the United States is not the sole superpower, but one among many regional great powers. Every year, the balance of power in the world becomes more and more even. And here is an important thing to note. This alliance isn't anti-Western or anti-American. The goal of this organization is to dismantle the Western bias systems, not to create a new form of dictatorship, but a fair, equitable system where every country has a fair say. Instead of abandoning international organizations like the UN, which Trump recently called useless, BRICS countries want to strengthen and make international institutions more powerful. They want to give much more representation at the Security Council to the Global South and reform or outright remove the veto power. The primary way BRICS countries are driving real change in the world is by ending the dominance of the US dollar and creating alternative financial institutions to challenge the IMF and the World Bank. This process, known as de-dollarization, involves facilitating trade between countries using local currencies instead of the US dollar. While this may seem like common sense to avoid the use of a foreign country's currency as an intermediary, technological barriers have made it difficult until recently. The global financial network has long relied on an international trading system called SWIFT, which handles cross-border payments and settlements. However, SWIFT favors the West, comes with high costs due to intermediaries, and has slow processing times, sometimes taking days to process payments. It's also not transparent, with hidden fees and difficult payment tracking, and most importantly, SWIFT depends on the US dollar, leaving countries vulnerable to being excluded if the US decides to shut them out, posing a major security risk. The US kicked out Russia from SWIFT and froze $300 billion in Russian assets at the flip of a switch. Regardless of what you think of Russia, this set off a major alarm in every non-Western country, signaling the need to diversify away from the dollar. In response, BRICS countries are developing their own systems, like CIPS, or China's cross-border interbank payment system. CIPS allows countries to use local currencies, bypassing the US dollar. Unlike SWIFT, CIPS directly clears and settles payments, offering instant processing. It's transparent, with clear fees and real-time tracking, and operates 24/7. CIPS is also free from geopolitical pressures that affect SWIFT, making it a much more neutral option. Through enabling direct communication between central banks, this not only improves efficiency, but also sovereignty, as it removes the need to rely on Western banks. This direct communication is a no-brainer, but its adoption has been slow because it threatens the profits of Western banks. The erratic trade policies of Trump, including launching a trade war against the entire world, have accelerated this shift by undermining global trust in the US dollar. In the past, when it looked like an economic recession was coming, investors would fly to safety, increasing their holdings in US Treasury bonds as the dollar was seen as a reliable and secure investment. However, for the first time, we're seeing a divergence. Even as the stock market falls, demand for US bonds is not rising. Instead, countries are allowing their bonds to expire at higher rates, signaling profound loss of trust in the dollar's stability and the security of US debt. The dollar has had the worst start to a year since 1973. Compared to previous years, it's at a historic low, having fallen 10% since the beginning of the year. Countries around the world are dumping their holdings of US Treasuries and investing in alternative assets like gold. China, historically the second largest holder of US Treasuries, have massively reduced their holdings. BRICS countries are rapidly expanding the use of local currencies in trade. Current estimates show that 25% of trade within the bloc is now conducted in domestic currencies, and that number is expected to rise each year. Already, 90% of the trade between Russia and China, as well as Russia and India, are being settled in local currencies. Countries like Egypt, Iraq, Turkey, Saudi Arabia, Vietnam, and Malaysia are one by one signing agreements to conduct trade using their own currencies. In some cases, this shift is effectively eliminating the US dollar from transactions altogether. Each signing of a new agreement represents another crack in the foundation of the US dollar's dominance as the world's reserve currency. More and more countries are bypassing the dollar in favor of local currencies and alternative financial systems. If you're liking this video so far, please take a second to like the video and subscribe to the channel. And please check out my Patreon if you can. These videos take a lot of work to make. Also, please open a new tab or switch apps real quick and follow me on Twitter if you can at NoWayNoHow. Thanks. Now back to the video. Trading in local currencies isn't the only way to de-dollarize. In fact, during the yearly BRICS conferences, there have been discussions about creating a new currency to serve as an alternative to the US dollar for clearing payments among BRICS countries. This currency could either be a shared BRICS digital currency or a basket of BRICS country currencies, allowing countries to bypass the dollar and settle transactions directly using their own units of exchange. There's also talk of a resource-backed model potentially tied to valuable commodities like oil, gold, or agricultural products that would add real-world value and stability to the currency. Such a move would be transformative for the world. If you were traveling in a BRICS country, you could use a fully digital currency that would instantly communicate between the central bank of your home country and the country you're visiting, settling payments in real time. This would be similar to China's existing WeChat or Alipay systems, but on a much bigger scale. This would also completely eliminate the need for intermediary banks or currency conversions, leading to faster and cheaper transactions. Now remember the World Bank and the IMF we discussed earlier? Well, the BRICS has a response to that too. BRICS has also established a bank that serves as an alternative to the World Bank and the IMF. Shockingly, in the 80-year existence of the World Bank and the IMF has always been led by a European, and the World Bank has always been headed by an American. As a result, it's kind of ironic to call it the World Bank when it has been led exclusively by representatives from one country that makes up about 4% of the world population. They are openly biased institutions towards the West, and that's where the new development bank comes in. The NDB provides an alternative to these institutions and has a balanced governance structure in which all BRICS countries have equal voting rights. The NDB offers fair loans and interest rates without imposing the political and economic reforms or austerity measures that come with loans from Western institutions. The bank is specifically designed to help developing countries by funding projects focused on critical infrastructure such as roads, energy, and water, as well as sustainable development initiatives like renewable energy and social programs in healthcare and education. Unlike Western institutions, which often prioritize wealth extraction for foreign corporations, the NDB focuses on fostering real long-term development rather than short-term profit. One of the biggest forces uniting the Global South is China's Belt and Road Initiative. As the world's largest economy measured in purchasing power parity, and the largest economy in BRICS, China has used its excess capital to invest in developing the infrastructure of countries around the world. Compare that with the US, who use their excess capital to invest in endless war. The scale of this initiative is staggering. Since its launch in 2013, China has spent $1.3 trillion on projects across more than 150 countries. Often referred to as the New Silk Road, the Belt and Road spans across Eurasia and the Global South, including ports, roads, airports, railways, high-speed rail, hospitals, schools, cellular and internet infrastructure, smart cities, and massive renewable energy projects. Being at the forefront of a lot of these technologies like 5G, they're able to share these with developing countries. Many Chinese ports, like Chansay Port in Peru, are fully automated with robots unloading and loading cargo. This cargo is either shipped across the Pacific or will be connected via a massive rail system built by China that spans the entire continent, linking ports all the way from Peru to Brazil. High-speed rail systems have also been constructed in developing countries like Uzbekistan and Laos, dramatically reducing travel times within the countries and stimulating their economies. I too have actually personally rode the one in Laos, and it was fast, easy, and convenient, and it made me frustrated that countries like Laos and Uzbekistan have more high-speed rail than in the United States, when we're supposedly the richest country on earth. In the future, China will complete the rest of the high-speed rail network connecting all of Southeast Asia. This will have massive benefits for the economies, tourism, and most importantly, the peaceful relations between the countries involved. Now look at this chart. Literally every single one of the fastest growing countries is outside the West. And under BRICS, as their economies grow, they will naturally complement one another, and the infrastructure will strengthen these ties diplomatically and economically. If you look at a map of each country's largest trading partner from the year 2000, the US was the biggest trading partner for the majority of the world's countries. Fast forward to 2024, and the situation has completely reversed, with China now the most important trade partner for the majority of world countries. The Western narrative often claims that China's actions are motivated by malicious intent, that they want something in return. And of course they want something in return. What country in history has ever done massive projects for other countries out of charity? Everything is done for a reason. However, the difference lies in China's approach, which it calls win-win diplomacy. They emphasize this concept frequently when discussing their intentions behind infrastructure projects. Meanwhile, the United States operates on a zero-sum gain trade policy, where it believes it must always be the disproportionate beneficiary in any transaction. This is the current administration's logic in imposing tariffs on nearly every country in the world and views trade deficits as a problem that needs fixing. But during the Biden and Obama administrations, it wasn't much better, with them lecturing down to these countries as problems to be dealt with and not treating them as equal partners. At the very least, BRICS offers Global South countries a new option, whereas in the past, they only had one choice in the West. So how has the US responded to the Belt and Road Initiative? Instead of offering an alternative, the West's response was to spend $1.4 billion on propaganda to spread misinformation and discredit the Belt and Road Initiative worldwide. They've also pressured countries into not participating in BRI. The truth is, the United States simply does not have the capacity to build the renewable energy infrastructure, 5G technologies, or rail networks that these countries need, let alone in the US itself. One of the biggest targets of misinformation about the Belt and Road Initiative has been Africa, but these claims have largely fallen on deaf ears. According to the 2025 Democracy Perception Index poll, not only does Africa have a better perception of China, but a majority of the world does as well. African countries have overwhelmingly made clear their preference to work with China, and it's not hard to see why.
Today, everywhere in Africa, everywhere in the world, the West is bombing democracy into our people, destroying what used to be paradise. China is now holding guns to our head and telling us that if you need assistance from me, you have to have this kind of government.
The vice president of the US came to Zambia, landed at a Chinese-built airport in Zambia, moved on a Chinese-built road in Zambia. The venue of this summit was actually a gift to Zambia by the Chinese government. And the key agenda of this summit was to curb Africa's cooperation with China in a Chinese gift to the African continent.
IMF director, he said on many occasions, which I find so funny, that there's China trying to lead an alternative project, and they say it in that negative tone. And I'm like, I would be super thrilled if China is leading an alternative regional project. We were not relying on the US dollar.
The West has claimed that China is the biggest threat to African nations and that they should be wary of becoming too dependent on Chinese partnerships. Because after all, we all know how amazing working with the West has been. I know we've colonized your continent for hundreds of years, sold your people into slavery, designed an international system that keeps you in perpetual states of poverty, and interfered in your countries when you strayed away from us. But obviously you should be terrified of working with the Chinese. It comes down to a simple question. If the West was so beneficial to the continent, why has the economic situation for many African countries remained unchanged for decades? This has all been facilitated by the global financial system that the West created. Now, for the first time, African nations have an alternative path, and the West is only just beginning to pretend it cares. That's why the Western liberal objections to China's presence look so stupid.
I've been very concerned lately about China. They are now all over Africa, buying things and investing over there and getting those countries dependent on them and supporting, non-democratic people. And I'm just
like
wondering,
whom?
Well,
we are in a country that supports Saudi Arabia.
yes, that's
Yeah?
true. They're in Africa. They're lending money to countries to build ports and different infrastructure.
build what?
Port harbors.
And what's wrong with that?
And well, because
Countries that need ports get ports.
but they're making people dependent on. I mean, I know it's the same thing that we've done, which is
No, it's not.
horrible around the world.
They are
but-
far more humanistic than the United States ever was.
Really? Okay.
Absolutely.
Great.
Of course, they are peddling for influence.
Yeah.
Yeah. But they are non-interventionists, absolutely non-interventionists in a way that Europeans, the West, has never managed to fathom.
But I have a feeling they have a longer-term thought process that
Okay.
is more
All right.
interventionist.
But
anyway,
let's judge what
so,
we
no.
see.
The truth is, many countries desperately need the financial support and infrastructure that they've long been denied access to, and now they finally have a much more fair and accessible way of acquiring them. Much of Africa's 5G and internet infrastructure is being built by Huawei, where Western firms are both unaffordable and unable to deliver on the continent in the first place. Across Africa, major rail projects have been built or are under construction. Countries like Nigeria, Ethiopia, and Kenya have connected their major cities and ports through both passenger and commercial rail. Chinese-built rail lines are creating stronger connections between African countries, leading to massive economic development.
Previously, we used to travel almost 8 hours or 10 hours, spend the whole day. But now, 4 hours or 4.5 hours, you're in Mombasa.
When you look at a map of what's already been built and what's planned, the future of Africa looks incredibly exciting and optimistic for this century. And it's not just rail, as renewable energy sources like solar, hydro, and wind are becoming more affordable and accessible, powering Africa's growing economies. China is a leader in these industries, and there are massive solar panel arrays in Morocco, Egypt, Kenya, and Zambia, hydroelectric dams in Uganda, Cote d'Ivoire, and Angola, and huge wind farms in Ethiopia, Namibia, South Africa, just to name a few examples. The West often presents these projects as imperialistic or neo-colonial, but that's simply a projection of their own historical atrocities. African leaders are not stupid, and no one is forcing them to sign these agreements with China. If you were an African leader, what would you choose? First, you could partner with the US or a European country. Their big firms like Nestle, British Petroleum, or ExxonMobil would extract your resources and send their profits to London or New York. They won't build any infrastructure beyond military bases. They'll lecture you on democracy and force you to change your policies to suit their interests. They won't improve the lives of your people outside a corrupt elite. And if you try to nationalize your resources or adopt policies they don't like, they'll orchestrate a regime change and replace you with someone who will comply. Or you could work with China, who at least nominally views African nations as equal partners and not as subordinates to be lectured to or pitied. They openly desire rare earth minerals, but in exchange, they offer to build ports, railways, and solar arrays. When Africa does supply rare earth minerals, China uses them to build things they need, like solar panels, electric vehicles, and smartphones affordably. China won't force governments to change their policies or build military bases to exert control. At the same time the US launched a trade war on the continent, China announced that it would drop all tariffs on imports from the 53 African nations in which it has diplomatic relations. China also gave up on its status as a developing country in the World Trade Organization, foregoing trade benefits that could better support developing nations. There's a famous quote that sums up the relationship between Africa and the two countries that comes from an unspecified Kenyan diplomat. Whenever China visits your country, a new hospital is built. Whenever a Western country visits Africa, you get a lecture. One of the biggest myths surrounding the Belt and Road Initiative is the idea that it's an intentional trap to steal African assets through something called debt trap diplomacy. This is pure propaganda, designed to scare people away from working with China. In reality, this claim has been thoroughly debunked by numerous Western journalists and academic studies.
A common portrayal of China's lending practices is known as debt trap diplomacy, a phrase made popular after being used in government documents during the Trump administration. The so-called debt trap is created when a country lends to poorer countries, intentionally overwhelming them with unsustainable debt, forcing them to surrender strategic assets, or concede increased political leverage. But so far, there's no evidence that such a debt trap has been sprung in Africa.
In Kenya, Chinese loans account for about 10% of the country's $70 billion total debt. And it's even less acute in Nigeria, where the Chinese debts are just about 3 to 4%. One country cannot control another country just by owning 4 to 10% of its debt.
Only a handful of countries on the African continent have a significant amount of debt owed to China, and most of them owe much more to private bond markets.
Africa does not have a Chinese debt problem. Angola weights about a third of all Chinese debt in Africa. So take Angola out of the issue, then you have an even less serious problem in that respect. So it's very important that we narrow down this problem to be what it is.
That's Bloomberg reporting this, by the way, not exactly a publication known for being China's biggest fan. You can also find an article from The Atlantic debunking this myth, along with multiple studies from institutions like Harvard Business School and the London School of Economics. These are some of the most Western-leaning institutions you can get, and they would be quick to criticize China if there was any substance to this claim. Yet they all reach the same conclusion: the debt trap narrative is false. When it comes to the West, every accusation is often a confession. Just look at the actual breakdown of external debt in Africa. The vast majority of the debt is owed to Western private banks or institutions like the IMF or the World Bank. In fact, the percentage of overall debt owed to China is so small that it's barely visible on the charts. Those tiny blue blocks represent China's share. The IMF itself released a report that explicitly states that Chinese loans are not the main debt burden in sub-Saharan Africa. China's share of sub-Saharan Africa's overall sovereign debt is just 6% of the total. The report goes on to say it is noteworthy that the debt owed to China has not been the principal contributor to the region's debt surge in the past 15 years. In other words, the West is projecting onto China exactly what it has been doing for decades. So what does the rise of BRICS mean to the West? Western politicians have been freaking out about the rise of BRICS and the fall of the dollar. Just take a look at how Donald Trump has reacted to the rise of the bloc.
BRICS was set up to degenerate our dollar and take our dollar as the standard. So anybody that's in BRICS is getting a 10% charge. And if we lost the world standard dollar, that would be like losing a war, a major world war. We would not be the same country any longer. You ever hear the expression, dollar is king? The dollar is king. We're going to keep it that way, okay? And now the domination like BRICS. I told anybody wants to be in BRICS, that's fine, but we're going to put tariffs on your nation. BRICS was an attack on the dollar. And I said, you want to play that game, I'm going to put tariffs on all of your product coming into the U.S. If they want to play games with the dollar, then they're going to be hit with a 100% tariff. The day they mention that they want to do it, those countries won't trade with us, we won't trade with them, and if any trading gets through, it'll be 100% tariff at least.
As you saw, Donald Trump even compared losing the dollar's dominance to losing a major world war. And he's right to say it would weaken America's position as a superpower. But the more desperate actions the US government takes to hold on to this power, the more it's speeding up the trend of its decline. The massive tariffs imposed on countries in BRICS, it's only validating their decision to join the bloc in the first place. This shows just how risky and oppressive the dollar's role as the world's reserve currency is for every country and incentivizes them to move further away. If the world were to de-dollarize, the US would lose its power to completely destroy a country's economy through tariffs, sanctions, or by kicking them out of SWIFT at a moment's notice. Countries like Cuba or Iran, who have had the development of their countries completely halted because of their bad relationship with Washington, would be free to pursue their own destiny. The truth is, de-dollarization is inevitable. It's no longer a question of if, but when. For the average Western citizen, the rise of BRICS shouldn't be a cause for concern. This shift isn't a zero-sum game. It doesn't mean it has to come at the expense of everyday people in the West. Instead, the dollar would become just one of many important currencies in the world. The only real losers here are a very small group of Western bankers and Wall Street elites. What we're seeing is a reshaping of the global system into a more democratic one. There's a famous quote that keeps coming to mind as I reflect on 2025 and how quickly the world is changing. There are decades where nothing happens, and there are weeks where decades happen. The world I imagined I'd be living in as a kid, or even just 5 years ago, is completely different from the reality we're experiencing now. The rise of the global south and the process of de-dollarization were always likely to happen eventually, but this was something that was supposed to unfold over decades. With the conflicts in the Middle East and Ukraine, combined with China's rapid rise and America's steady decline, all these trends have been put into overdrive. The US unipolar moment, when America was the undisputed global power, seemed like it would last forever. Yet, in less than a decade, we've seen that dominance unravel completely. Looking back at my childhood and the world I thought would define my future, it's clear how much things have changed. Only time will tell how the world will look going forward and how peacefully America and Europe will accept their new rules as just two spheres of influence in a more multipolar world. One now shared with many other great powers. If you've made it this far, please take a second to like the video and subscribe to the channel. Also, please look in the description below for my Patreon, Substack, and Twitter, and I'll see you guys in the next video. Peace.